Hello everyone, this is Lala and I'm going to be doing another ranking challenges by era and by gender video where I did the ranking era 1 men video and the era 2 women video as the people who represented that category on season 40 were out before the finale. So I did those videos first and now I have to do the other 6. And today I'm going to be talking about the Era 1 women, where I am ranking all the women who debuted on Era 1 and did at least 3 seasons, because 3 seasons is enough to have a decent enough sample size based on how they play socially, politically, competitively, and all that jazz. You have a decent amount of data compared to a one-timer or a two-timer. So I do have to go over some of the regulations that I have when it comes to ranking these women and ranking for this type of video. So, obviously, the first factor that I am considering is competition, since the show's called The Challenge for Goodness Sakes. So, this involves dailies, eliminations, and performances in the finals. Whether you get to the final, you're close to getting to the final, or you win the final. So, when it comes to how I see things, if you have a lot of early boots, you're going to be lower on the list, especially if you have a lot of early boots and you really make it to the end or close to the end. So that will cause you to be lower. If you're also someone who has a lot of good seasons and a lot of bad seasons, you will probably be lower than someone who only has good seasons, and they've also done a decent amount of seasons as well. Since if you're booted early, it means you're either poor politically, you're poor when it comes to performing in the challenges, or a combination of both. And if you're repeating that in several seasons, it just means you're not a good challenger. So this also includes final wins, finals reach, and close to a final. So final wins means the amount of finals that you've actually won. And when it comes to the Era 1 women, like the Era 1 men, have technically, 4 of those seasons had everyone making it to the end. So getting to a quote-unquote final really doesn't hold any weight, since no one goes home on those seasons. And honestly, the final challenge on those first 4 seasons weren't the finals as how we know them now, where there's several different tasks that you have to do during the final. It lasts the entire day or several days. It's nothing like how it is, especially in those first 4 seasons. So if you made it to a final in those first 4 seasons, that doesn't really hold much weight. So finals reached, this means the amount of finals that someone's reached in their seasons. But one thing that I definitely do have to take into consideration, so let's just say you made it to 10 finals, but you've only won 2 out of those 10s. That means that your ratio of the finals reached towards, or compared to the finals win, is very small. It means you only won 2 out of the 10 finals that you've made it, meaning 20%. So, based off the rate of finals reached and finals won, the percentage is pretty low. So that's something that I'm taking into place. If you made it into a lot of finals based on the amount of seasons that you did, that is going to be a good thing, and you'll probably be higher on the list. The other factor that I am considering is if you made it close to the final. So these are people who were booted within either the second to last round of their gender or the last round of their gender before the final. So let's just say the last 2 women booted before the final on their seasons are people that I consider to make it close to the final. Anything below that really doesn't hold any weight. So another thing that I definitely do have to factor is when it comes to the daily stats, I don't put too much weight on them. But especially when it comes to the Era 1 and even some of the Era 2 people, there are a lot of team challenges, and they definitely do inflate the amount of daily numbers. So that's definitely something that I have to look into. Another factor that fits into the competitions is the bad elimination record. So let's just say if you've lost most of the eliminations that you've been on, you're going to be lower on the list, since it means that you can't save yourself when it comes to clutch time. And when it comes to time to prove yourself against someone else, you really can't do it. And it also means that your chances of making it to the end are a lot lower if you have a low elimination record. There are some people who have a decent amount of elimination wins, but they have the same amount of losses. So that's definitely something that I have to take into factor when I'm ranking people as well. So the last thing that I'm looking into is the amount of finals that a contestant missed based on the amount of seasons that they did, and they weren't even close. So these are the people who are early boots, and for this list, I'm considering early boots to be someone who was booted in the first 2 rounds of their season. But if you're booted anytime before the last 2 rounds before the final, that's not good since it means that you can't make it to the end game or whatsoever. So all of that is what I'm factoring here. The next category I'm looking into is longevity. So this means the amount of seasons that they have done, the right bracket of years they've competed on. So if they've done their seasons within like a 2 to 3 year period, they will be lower than someone who has similar, if not better stats, but they competed within a 20-year gap. Because it's way too small of a sample size, we don't know how the game would have aged, and we don't know how they would have matured, and it's really not fair to give someone props for doing better on a few seasons 20 years ago. And another factor with Era 1 is due to the era and format of some of the seasons that they competed on. If you did 3 seasons on a format that is easier and weaker, I can't give you the same amount of props. So obviously, the less seasons that someone did, they will be lower on the list. There's a lot of women here who just did 3 seasons, so they either didn't accomplish much when it comes to stats during their brief careers, compared to some of the other women on this list. So I definitely do have to take that into consideration. And when there's a lot of data, I just have to put them lower. So I kind of already talked about seasons only done in a few years, how they will be lower on the list. If you've done more seasons and you have good stats, you will be higher on the list. Since, quite frankly, there's a lot more data and your stats. We've seen you thrive or go through every single era, every single format, and if you've been successful in all of them, you deserve a lot more props. And we've seen your game age, we've seen your game mature, and we have that data. Also, if you've done seasons in many years and decades and you've thrived in all of them, you'll be higher on the list. And especially with the creation of All Stars, where a lot of these Era 1 people can come back and make names for themselves. This is a way to see how they age. Though, as we will go through on the list, we had a lot more Era 1 men coming back compared to Era 1 women. So that data there is kind of just sad to watch. So, the third category that I am heavily taking into consideration is the eras and formats that they played in. So, this is the case for Era 1 and even Era 2 to a lesser extent, but with Era 1 specifically, there are seasons within that era where there are literally no eliminations. There's even one season where there's no opposing element at all. There are some seasons that had huge team formats where barely anyone went home and most of the cast made it to the final and many people won their seasons. So essentially it's very easy to do well in Era 1 compared to Era 2, Era 3, and Era 4, where the formats that were in Era 1 don't really exist much, if at all, in the other eras. So I had to take all that into consideration when it comes to ranking these challengers and these Era 1 women specifically. So if you mainly did seasons that had no elimination, so essentially the first 4 seasons, you're going to be lower on the list. Since you made it to the end, no one went home, and the competitiveness is very thin. If you did duo or individual seasons and thrived in them, there are a few seasons in Era 2 that were like that, but essentially every season in Era 3 and Era 4 either had duo or individual seasons. If you thrived in those seasons, you're going to be higher on the list since 1, more people go home, 2, your chances of making it to the final, much less winning, are a lot smaller since only 1 or 2 people are going to win. If you mainly did seasons that had vote offs, so like Battle of the Seasons 1 and both Battle of the Sexes seasons. So in those 3 seasons where there are vote offs, or even the island technically, or in seasons where everyone goes to the final, where that is essentially the first 4 seasons, you're going to be lower on the list since it's very easy to make it to the end of those seasons, especially on seasons where no one went home, and two, where there are seasons where you don't have to compete to save yourself. So that's pretty self explanatory there. And there are a few women that kind of fall in that category, where there's only a ceiling as to how high I could put them due to that. And there's some of these women who didn't even compete on seasons that had any eliminations whatsoever. Whether in the fact that no one went home or you didn't have to fight against someone to stay in the house and to send that person home. There are a lot of seasons in Era 1 and even Era 2 where there are large team seasons where, one, there are barely any eliminations throughout the season, so if you avoid those few eliminations, your chances to make it to the end are very high. And on some of these team seasons, a majority of the cast makes it to the final, so it really isn't that hard to do. And on some of these seasons, there are teams that had like 6, 7, 8, 9 people who win the season, where it's a lot easier to do so, where on a lot of the later seasons, sometimes one person wins overall, or one person per gender, or one pair ends up winning. So if you're on large team seasons, and that's where a majority of your success came from, you're going to be lower on the list. And obviously, if you have more success on more modern seasons, so Era 3, Era 4, and the spin-offs, you're going to be higher on the list since it's much harder to do well on modern seasons compared to earlier seasons where, one, the seasons are actually longer, especially on the flagship show. So you enduring those long seasons really shows a lot of effort. More people goes home on modern seasons and even on the spin-offs compared to the Era 1 and even some Era 2 seasons. And three, the challenges in general are just harder on those seasons, and they're competing against much younger people. So if you're thriving there, I have to give you your props. So the final element that I am looking into to a much smaller extent is the politics. So whether they had alliances that helped them make it to the end, where they exerted a lot of control, what moves they made to benefit themselves, to get as far as they did in their season, or to get rid of their biggest threat, and if they're using their politics to actively avoid eliminations, that's something that I do think needs to be given a lot of props. Since some people avoid eliminations because they're layups, but other people are avoiding eliminations due to their allegiances and their people winning power. So that's definitely something that has to be taken into consideration. But outside of that, there's really no other criteria, so let's just get to the list. So, at dead last, which is 25th place for this ranking list, is Cynthia Roberts, who competed on Road Rules All Stars, Battle of the Sexes 2, and All Stars 3. I really don't have much of anything to say about Cynthia. Her first season was a non competitive season where everyone made it to the end and there's no other team or people to compete against, and they did all the tasks together. Her second season wasn't a good one as they decided to keep people around based on politics and competitiveness, where Cynthia was booted early. I believe she was the fifth boot this season because she made a comment about not wanting to be the leader for the round, and she didn't care if she went home or not. She did return to All Stars 3 after 17 years and was so far removed from the show and the cast where she didn't really know anyone, which made her an easy target and she was sent home first. There's really nothing impressive here, as one season essentially doesn't really count, and she has two early boots. And one of those seasons didn't even have an elimination yet either. At 24th is Montana McGlynn, who competed on Road Rules versus Real World, the Gauntlet 1, and the Gauntlet 2. So she is another one that didn't really do anything impressive during her time on the show, which was brief, as she has the minimum amount of seasons to be considered on this list at 3 seasons. Her first season didn't have anyone go home on it, and I don't think she was considered one of the stronger women anyways, so I do consider the season to be kind of janky, and even this season was shorter than the next 2 seasons that had the same format, so the season was even easier than season 3 and 4. Then she was booted first on her second season, The Gauntlet 1, because she wasn't fitting in with the group whatsoever, and I do think they considered her to be one of the weaker people on the real world team as well, if I'm remembering things correctly. Then her final season is The Gauntlet 2, where she is decent enough, if not unnotable, only to get booted mid-season against Beth. Essentially, she had one season where she wasn't an early boot compared to a Cynthia, but she also lost 2 eliminations. There just really isn't anything to say about her in general. It also doesn't help that she only really competed in the old OG era as well. So that kind of caused her run to age even worse. So at 23rd is Jisela Delgado, who competed on Battle of the Seasons 1, Battle of the Sexes 1, The Gauntlet 2, and All Stars 1. It really wasn't a shocker that she was going to be very low on the list, but a part of me did think that she would be a bit higher. Gisele's first season was Battle of the Seasons 1, where she was partnered with Adam and they had to fight for the spot in the final. They were booted in the second to last round before the final, which is still early in the season because everyone who was evicted on the season was evicted or eliminated in the first half. But it was mainly because she was a partner, or weak partner. Then we move on to the next season, Battle of the Sexes 1, where there was voting that was all over the place, to be honest, but she was seen as one of the weaker women, causing her to be booted. She was the third woman to be booted on the Gauntlet 2, where she conveniently wanted to go in and didn't even try in her elimination against Ruthie, so she apparently quit. So, from what I've heard, she left early on the last 2 seasons since her work didn't allow her full time to stay the filming time, but she still wanted the appearance fee. Obviously, she returned 16 years later to compete on All Stars 1, which should have bolstered her up since she made it to the final on that season and won an elimination with Eric against Kendall and Nehemiah. But when you really look at it, over half of the cast made it to the final, so there weren't that many eliminations, and there wasn't much competitiveness on the season. And her performance in the final itself wasn't good, as she was taken out with Derek right in the beginning of it. She might have gotten a small bump from All Stars 1, but her journey on the show overall has been very unremarkable. At 22nd is Beth Stolarcyzk, who competed on Road Rules vs. Real World, Battle of the Seasons 1, Battle of the Sexes 1, the Inferno 2, the Gauntlet 2, the Duel 1, the Gauntlet 3, All Stars 1, and All Stars 3. So, before starting this list, I knew Beth was going to be pretty low on the list, despite doing several seasons of the show for like 25-ish years. Her first season was Road Rules vs. Real World, where there are no eliminations, and she was one of the weaker people on the season. So moving on from that janky season, and it's technically the only season where she made it to the final, meaning that the one season that she partook in where there's no vote outs or eliminations was the only season that she made it to the final, meaning that in any other season where there was a vote out or an elimination, she was booted before the final. So her next 2 seasons were seasons that were based on competing for your spot in the final, but while Beth was a notably poor performer, she wasn't booted from either Battle of the Seasons 1 or Battle of the Sexes 1 because of that. She was extremely disliked and no one wanted to deal with her, causing her to be the first boot on Battle of the Seasons 1 and the second woman boot on Battle of the Sexes 1. Her poor social game is a huge flaw that never really recovers or improves. Her best season is easily the Gauntlet 2, where she became a captain after beating Ruthie, and she also took out her enemy in Montana. But both of those were eliminations were people that she had more of a size advantage of. She quit in the second to last female round because she didn't like the elimination and knew she was going to get watched by Aneesa. And this is the only season where she was close to getting to a final where there was an elimination. Oh, she also quit early on in the Inferno, too. The Duel 1 is one of her better seasons, where she did win a daily, and she was actually in an alliance with people like Wes, Aneesa, Svetlana, though the latter turned on her, and Nehemiah, and she technically won the elimination against Svetlana midway, but that stupid rule caused her to be booted. And had that not happened, she could have definitely made it deep into the season. Her final flagship season is The Gauntlet 3, where she didn't really do much of note, but she was the first victim of the vet men's cutting the fat strategy on the vet team, losing to Cole in elimination roughly around the mid-season point of view, or portion of the season. It seemed like Beth calmed down a bit on All Stars 1, where she wasn't pissing anyone off and lasted a few rounds. I believe she made it to the mid-season portion, and she did get screwed by the last-minute partners twist, forcing her to go into elimination with Cyrus, if I'm remembering correctly. She came in as an alternate after many early women DQs on All Stars 3, refused to do a challenge, beat Kendall in a larger size beneficial elimination, and was sent home swiftly by Jonay, though she kind of quit. But she quit because she knew she was losing. She is higher than some of the others due to having experience and winning some eliminations, but her record for someone who has done so many seasons is just piss poor. She is going to be on All Stars 5, but I don't know if that's really going to change her record in any way, especially the better. 21st is Ayanna Mackins, who competed on Extreme Challenge, Battle of the Sexes 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, All Stars 2, and All Stars 4. I don't think I'm going to have a whole lot to say about Anna, and it's mainly due to the format on a lot of the seasons that she was a part of. Her first season was Extreme Challenge, where no one went home but her, since she ended up getting herself DQ'd at the game very early on for hitting Christian, so there really isn't much to discuss there. Her second season was on Battle of the Sixes 1, where she did eighth, or she got eighth place out of the woman, where she would have made it further had she not quit due to being frustrated with the politics and all that stuff. She performed solidly on the challenges, but she wasn't a top tier person on that season, but she did have a few friends from what I remembered. Her final flagship season, Battle of the Sixes 2, really wasn't a good one, where she was eliminated fourth out of the women due to her poor leadership and personality. So what we have here is a janky season where no one went home, and two other seasons where there were no eliminations in general. Ayanna returned on All Stars 2, where it seemed like she adapted fine enough to the game, as she won two eliminations against Leah and Katie, though those names really aren't the most impressive, and she was a part of the King's Palace Alliance, but even they got annoyed with her after a while. She never won a daily and ended up getting last place in the final, but at least she got to a final. She would return for All Stars 4, where she pissed everyone off or lacked a lot of allies and pissed off a lot of the people in the power, Cam and Leroy, where she was targeted early and was eliminated by Rachel in the second elimination. Or you might consider to be the first elimination, since Janelle quit before that elimination took place. So Ayanna versus Rachel, technically the first one. So her first one was during a time where the challenge was at its simplest, with mixed success there, and it was the same when she played All Stars, with only one finals appearance and two, technically three early boots overall. At 20th, I have Trishelle Cannatella, who competed on the Gauntlet 1, the Inferno 1, Battle of the Seasons 2, Rivals 2, and All Stars 1. Trishelle is another person who is all over the place, but we have a bit more of a sample size with her due to competing in the first era, the third era, and All Stars. But there are still a bit more negatives than positives. Her first season was the Gauntlet 1, where she was a mid at best performer who was being protected by Mike throughout quite a few of those rounds, but we did see her win in elimination against Steve, though she went home the very next round after that, losing to Sarah in the mid season part of the season. We move on to the very next season, the Inferno one, where she got on the bad side of the likes of Mike and Cora and a few of the others, and she was sent into the first woman's elimination, where she easily lost to Holly. She wouldn't do the show for another decade, where she was placed on the Vegas team on Battle of the Seasons 2, where she only knew Alton on their team, and they were seemingly in the majority alliance at some point, but that fell apart after a few rounds, and they were on their own. Her team won two dailies on the season, and one of them was one when it was just herself and Dustin, and she won an elimination with Dustin against Marie and Rob, where they actually got second place in the final as a duo who didn't even know each other, which was very impressive. We start to see a repeat of her first season, where she has a decent enough or a good in this scenario season and has a really poor succeeding season where she was partnered with Sarah on Rivals 2 and she ended up quitting after the first woman's elimination due to some sort of injury and drama. She did return on All Stars 1, but she yet again doesn't do well there at all either, where she ends up being the first woman booted on the season, where she would lose to Kendall on that season. There were some glimpses of her being a decent competitor, but her negatives are just so much stronger than her positives. So I really have no choice but to support her here. At 19th, I have Ibis Nieves, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 2, the Gauntlet 2, and the Ruins. Looking at her career, there really isn't much that's really impressive about her journey, but she never really did poorly or horribly either. Her first season was on Battle of the Sexes 2, where the women were voting people out based on competitive or political elements regarding the women. She made it through about two-thirds throughout the season, and the woman apparently regretted booting her due to her supposedly being good at puzzles. I don't have a whole lot to say about her on the Gauntlets 2, which is weird, since that was really the only season she made it to the final on, and it's also the only season that she won. But I think it's due to the rookie team not really having any alliances and being very against it, and the jankiness of that format. So I guess she held her own, since she was never put into elimination on the season, which I do give her credit for, and then the final was janky as heck as well. And then on her final season, where she was booted somewhat early, but I guess kind of in the mid portion of the season, she was actually going to be safe, but Veronica pulled off another suave political move, which got Ibis sent in over her, and she lost to Kimberly in elimination. Overall, I have to say that she's either an average or slightly below average player who doesn't have much bad, good, or anything stand out. And even the season that she won, especially the final, was just very janky and kind of unnotable. At 18th is Julie Stoffer, who competed on Extreme Challenge Battle of the Sexes 1, the Inferno 1, the Inferno 2, and the Gauntlet 2. Honestly, I really don't know how I feel about Julie as a player overall, since there are some moments that showed potential and promise, and then she completely falls flat otherwise, and flatlined otherwise. She actually was one of the stronger women on our team during Extreme Challenge, winning 2 MVPs, but we know by now that I don't really consider those seasons heavily into my rankings due to the jankiness of it and knowing going home on those seasons. We move on to her second season, Battle of the Sexes 1, where she was booted first because she was so disliked by the other women due to stuff that happened outside of the competition, though she was far from the weakest performer, but it also just shows how weak her political and social game was. And then we go to the Inferno one, where she herself still wasn't liked much by her real world team, but she did okay in the challenges this season. But she was essentially sacrificed during one of the later rounds because they wanted to keep Katie around to weaken the other team, seeing that more important than whatever strengths Julie had. And also pissing Qual off definitely isn't the way to gain longevity for yourself. Losing to Katie in the elimination also just isn't a good look. And in general, Julie's elimination record really isn't good, though she only competed in 2 of them. She came back for the Inferno 2, where she was a decent enough performer on the team, wasn't pissing anyone off, and made it deep into the season, but she was sent home during the second to last round, where she ended up losing against Tonya in the season. And like I mentioned earlier, her poor elimination is something I do hold against her. On the Inferno one, I didn't consider her to be eliminated in the second to last female round, where obviously we had Leah booted the round after her, and then in the round after that, which was the last round, Coral and Veronica were nominated. So it's definitely intended for another woman to go home, and the potential for another woman to go home happened there. But they both won their life shielders, hence David going home. But technically, she wasn't put in the second to last women's round since the last round, which was 2 rounds after Judy left, it was eligible for a woman to go home. So that's why I counted it for the Inferno 2, which is why it's pink there and not on the Inferno 1. Anyways, her last season, the Gauntlet 2, had her being one of the better performing women in the challenges, and she was never sent into elimination, where she made it to her first real final, but her poor attempt at cheating caused them to lose. But also the jankiness of that final shouldn't have even put them in that position when it comes to solely just eating the routine. With Judy Ming competing only on the OG era, it does hold her back on this ranking, right where it seemed like she was getting better as a player, and she could have done decently had she continued on. She retired from the show, so there really isn't a whole lot else to talk about her. I think overall, she's probably mediocre, or maybe a bit less, though it's less sloppy than some of the others below her, and did show some promise as her career was ending, and was decent enough in the challenges. At 17th, I have Katie Cooley, who was on The Gauntlet 1, The Inferno 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, The Gauntlet 2, Fresh Meat 1, The Gauntlet 3, The Duel 2, The Ruins, Cutthroat, Battle of the Eras, All Stars 1, and All Stars 2. I do think Katie's journey is kind of all over the place throughout her challenge career, and while I think that it's clear that she isn't a good challenger, I don't think she's as terrible as people claim she is. Katie definitely did piss off her Road Rules teams with her attitude on the Gauntlet 1, and she was seen as one of the weaker players, where she does win an elimination against Montana, then sent home against Rachel B not long afterwards. I think her standout season is the Inferno one, where she was on the outs with her team, which is definitely her fault, and she definitely started working with the other team. But we did see her winning two eliminations against Julie and David later on in the season, and she did end up winning the season, the only season that she actually won. Whatever potential she had after that season was pretty much disintegrated and went away, which is why she is lower on the list. Battle of the Sexes 2 was her next season, and she went home in the middle of the season since she decided to make a large move in splitting up the veterans by booting Rachel, only to go home the very next round. Katie then ended up making it to the final on the Gauntlet 2, and despite being invisible on the edit, her making it to her second and final here showed that she must have been doing something right. She was partnered with Eric on Fresh Meat 1 and got booted around mid-season, where they ended up losing against Tina and Kenny in Exile. Her next season is The Gauntlet 3, where she was on the outs with the veteran team and was seen as an oldie vet woman, so she was going to be a victim of the trim the vet strategy. But because of how dominant the veteran team ended up being, she was booted right before the final and made it to the end game, only to be taken out by Paula. Katie gets booted on the Duel 2 and the Ruins relatively early, where she loses against Jen on the former and loses against Sarah on the latter. It's clear that Katie was kind of getting over the show around this point in time, though her final season for over the decade was Cutthroat, where she was on the outs with her team and was sent into elimination, where Siobhan quits because Katie was probably going to beat her, and she just beat Aya before losing to Camilla mid-season. It wouldn't be until the creation of All Stars where Katie will return to the show, and this was probably her best showing in a while, making it past the halfway point, but there isn't a lot to talk about. She's saved by the lifesaver by Mark, so that was good, and then she ended up getting eliminated with Liturian by Kendall and Mark on the season. This was also a very non competitive season as well, which I definitely have to note. She came back a few months later for All Stars 2, where she won on daily, though it was a large team challenge, so it doesn't hold as much weight, and she was in early boots there, where she was sent home by Ayanna. Her return to the flagship show on Battle of the Eras was underwhelming, as she was sent right into elimination for getting last on the first daily and losing to Aneesa on the first round of the game. Katie had a few solid to decent seasons, though most of those were the very early seasons where the formats were a lot easier and were large team seasons, and a lot of poorer to mid seasons, but we will see how she does on All Stars 5. At 16th is Emily Bailey, who competed on Extreme Challenge, Battle of the Seasons 1, and Battle of the Sexes 1. So, from here on out, we're going to get a bunch of 3-season wonders because most of them have limited seasons and primarily played in the early era. And I feel like Emily is the epitome of this. Emily was on Extreme Challenge where she was an okay enough competitor as she went an MVP later on in the season, but her team would lose the season. And I've discussed ad nauseum how janky the format for the first 4 seasons were. On her second season at Battle of the Sexes 1, she was a part of the big move to send home Veronica and Yes for getting fourth in the daily, so all 3 of the teams in the inner circle, which included herself and Timmy, could stay in the inner circle, which worked, where her and Timmy were there the entire season and securing the spot on the final, while also backing off from Piggy and Chadwick when they got the backlash for the move. They ended up winning a few of the later season dailies, but it ended up with them losing yet again to the real world team. Sorry, not yet again. This was actually yes, it was yet again because they always used to the real world. Sorry, yeah, this is her second season in a row where she lost to real world, so I'm correct on that. Anyways, on our final season, Battle of the Sexes 1, we saw her influence the inner circle to make so many moves throughout the season, where she got them to boot Rachel, Veronica, and probably more people that I forgot to remember, and she competed well out of all the women, but then quit because her boyfriend James was sent home later on in the season. We never saw her on a season with an elimination, which makes her game even more dated, which is why she is the lowest out of these three season winners that I am going to delve into. But she was very good politically and she could compete well as well. But in general, she competed on three of the more jankier seasons, and she's too stuck in the early 2000s, where the show's too different now, and she only did three seasons. At 15th, I have Kina Dean, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 2, The Gauntlet 2, and The Duel 1. I don't think I'm going to have a whole lot to say about her, partially due to her only being on three seasons, and partially due to them being on older eras slash formats. Anyways, Kina debuted on Battle of the Sexes 2, as she didn't last long at all on that season, as she was the third boot, and it was partially due to politics and performance. Her standout season was obviously The Gauntlet 2, where she became the captain after Joe quit, and they did a bunch of challenges where they won with her being a captain, but she did have to go into elimination whenever they lost on Women's Day, where she did beat Cara and Jillian in eliminations, but it did lead to them winning. The rookies team, I mean. Her final season was the Duo 1, where she was working with DM, Jodi, Robin, and some of the other guys, and they did have a decent amount of control on their season, and she did win a daily, but their performance here was definitely seen as underwhelming in comparison to her last season, as she did lose against Svetlana, though she made it pretty deep in the season. So she has one bad season, one good season, and another decent season, so she's kind of middle of the road when it came to her time on the show, given her small sample size. At 14th, I have Cara Zavaleta, who competed on the Gauntlet 1, the Gauntlet 2, and the Inferno 3. I didn't know if I was going to put her higher or lower than some of the other people, a few spots above or below her, since they all did three seasons, but she's in the middle of them. I felt like she had a better track record than Kina based on the amount of seasons they did, where she made it to the final in both and had a decent enough season on Gauntlet 2, where Kina was an early out on one of them, so that's why Kara is higher. So she was on the Gauntlet 1, where she was with her boyfriend Dave, and it didn't seem like she was that high on the totem pole when it comes to the dynamics of the Road Rules team, but she did hold her own. She won two eliminations in the season against Eka and Theo, and had some decent enough performances in the dailies, and then won the season. Though she's probably like the fourth strongest woman, or maybe fifth on that team, but she had to work to get to the final. Her worst season is the Gauntlet 2, where she lasted about two-thirds throughout the season, if my mathematical calculation is correct. And her friendship with Susie made them both a target, since people saw it as an alliance and them attempting to make something with the guys, and she was sent home by Kina on the season, where she wasn't seen as one of the stronger women. Her final season, the Inferno 3, had her essentially playing for Susie, where she threw many of the lifesavers to ensure Susie would save herself, which pissed off her allies, but it cost her to make it to her second final, where her team ended up losing. I didn't get the grasp that she cared much for the game, and while she has a decent enough stats with eliminations and finals appearances, I don't know how much of it was based on strong performances or gameplay from her, rather than the fact that these are large team formats and things which are simply easier. At 13th is Holly Shand, who competed on the Challenge 2000 Battle of the Seasons 1 and the Inferno 1. So don't expect me to have a whole lot to say about her. So her first season is a pretty janky one, as no one went home on a season, and everyone went to the finals. But she did her job well enough on her team, and she did get her first win on the Challenge 2000. Her second season, Battle of the Seasons 1, involved the pairs on each team having to compete for the three spots in the final. Though she did survive the first four votes, she just missed the final with her partner, Josh, and the format of the season was weird, with no one going home in the second half, but she technically missed the final by a round. The season that was pretty impressive of her was her final season, the Inferno 1, where she was one of, if not the strongest woman on the Road Rules team, as she won a lifesaver, beat Trishelle in an early elimination, and was a consistent performer on the dailies and the final, causing them to win. So she did well during the era she competed on, but she only competed on three seasons, which is the bare minimum to make it onto this ranking, The first era is notably the weakest era regarding the competition, women, and the format of the seasons, and it just doesn't age as strongly compared to future eras or some of the women who've competed on more seasons and in harder eras. At 12th is Roni Martin, who competed on Road Rules versus Real World, The Gauntlet 1, and All Stars 3. So she's the final person that I'm writing about, or at least for now, or for good on the list, depending on what changed from writing this and recording this, who just did 3 seasons, but she has similar stats to Holly in a lot of ways. Roni also won a season, Road Rules versus Real World, where absolutely no one went home, and this season was shorter than the following 2 seasons in season 3 and 4, so it's easier to make it to the end on that season and to perform better. But she was a good performer on her Road Rules team. Her second season, The Gauntlet 1, led to another win where she was seen as one of the stronger women on the Road Rules team that the guys wanted to keep around as she won a life stealer, though it could be argued that Rachel and Veronica were stronger than her, and she was never targeted in the season, which led them to win the season. What caused her to go higher than the last several women that only did 3 seasons on this list was her performance on All Stars 3, where she's the only one who competed on a recent season. She had absolutely no connections to anyone on the cast due to either not competing in 20 years or everyone else debuting and playing the game long after her, but she was able to find herself in an alliance that carried her deep enough into the game, but she was eventually taken out in the 2/3 portion of the season by Jonay. She did okay on a modern season, which bolstered her up here, but there still isn't too much to talk about when it comes to her resume. Just missing the top 10 at 11th is Kendall Sheppard, who competed on the Inferno 1, All Stars 1, All Stars 2, and All Stars 3. So we're finally moving on from the woman who only just did 3 seasons to someone who just did 4 seasons. Obviously, her only flagship season is the Inferno one, where she was kind of just there but was convinced to put herself into elimination so Timmy wouldn't be sacrificed, and she did end up beating Leah, which isn't much of an accomplishment, but she did win the season. We wouldn't see her for another 2 decades, where she came back on All Stars 1, but she did have a pretty strong showing as she won 3 dailies and 2 eliminations against Katie Elitarian and Trishelle, though they're not the strongest names, and she made it pretty far despite a lot of the people trying to get her out in the season. But she lost with Nehemiah against Jisela and Eric right before the final. Her following 2 seasons were pretty disappointing though, with her being pulled due to COVID mid-season on All Stars 2, where she probably would have made it a lot further had that not happened, and getting sent home early by Beth in a physical elimination, though she did win a daily on that season. She could somewhat hold her own in the modern era and has 2 good seasons in completely different eras, so it's why I have her here, and I don't blame her for All Stars 2. It's essentially pretty slim pickings overall, but she showed more in more recent seasons compared to a lot of the others. Barely making it to the top 10 of the Era 1 woman who did 3 seasons is Tina Barta, who competed on The Gauntlet 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, The Inferno 2, Fresh Meat 1, The Duel 1, Battle of the Eras, All Stars 2, All Stars 3, and All Stars 4. I'm actually really shocked that Tina managed to make it onto the top 10 women from this era, and I think it's because people oddly forget about her original one. Obviously, her first season, the Gauntlet one, isn't a good one, as she was sent home relatively early by Coral, but she started performing better from that point onwards. She was one of the stronger women on Battle of the Exes 2, as she got cut right before the final, in a season that had the woman very divided politically, and even winning a challenge when she was a captain, as she became even closer to Rachel and Veronica on the Inferno 3, where they were very politically insulated on that team, and she won an early elimination against Robin, causing her to make it to the final there. But she would be one of the reasons why they lost it due to her poor endurance. Her best showing overall is definitely Fresh Meat, one where she didn't let Kenny outrun her when it comes to the politics, as she has just as big, if not a bigger personality than he does, and they're able to win 2 eliminations against Katie and Eric and Thea and Chanda, and made certain deals and allegiances to protect themselves, causing them to get second place on the season. The growing momentum Tina had as a player over the last 3 seasons that she did ended when she stupidly decided to punch Beth in the face on the duel one, causing her to be the first woman booted, where she has a good chance of making it far on the season had she not done that. She wouldn't come back for another 15 years until the creation of All Stars, where she was on All Stars 2, winning a daily, though it was a large team one, but she got immunity. But she decided to not compete in the elimination against Melinda, causing her to get booted relatively early. Tina knew that she had to redeem herself on the next season, but an early injury knocked her out of All Stars 3. Although I do see here that she did win an elimination against Cynthia. She didn't really perform well on All Stars 4, as she was in the bottom group a decent amount of the time and ended up unintentionally screwing over Rachel. Despite this being the first time the Mean Girls trio reunited in the game since the Inferno 2, but she was eventually booted against Cam roughly around the two-thirds portion of the season. She made her flagship return on Battle of the Eras, where she performed decently in some of the dailies and won an elimination against Emily, though it was janky, only to be booted by Michelle as one of the last Era 1 people standing, closer to the mid portion of the season. I think she was a pretty solid player when Era 1 was taking place, but her return has been disappointing with messy politics and weaker performances, though never a very early boot. But there are some interesting moments that kept her interesting as a player, even on her lackluster return seasons. At ninth is Tonya Cooley, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 1, The Gauntlet 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, The Inferno 2, Fish Meat 1, The Inferno 3, The Island, and The Ruins. Tonya is another person that I find to be pretty inconsistent in a different way from Tina, whose game can be evenly split by performance in two eras, which really isn't the case for Tonya, as she has a decent amount of poor seasons and a decent amount of good seasons. Tonya really wasn't notable on her first season Battle of the Sexes 1, where she was booted roughly around the halfway point of the season, though she was the worst performer for a few rounds if I remember correctly, though that might have involved some sort of DQ. Her second season, the Gauntlet 1, was a really bad one for her, as she got injured early on and she was sent out second, losing the elimination to Steve. She performed a lot better on Battle of the Sexes 2, but we started to see her flaws in her political social game, which would follow her for the rest of her challenge career, but she did make it pretty deep in the game, though she just missed the end game of the season and had to dodge a few bullets when people wanted her gone earlier. Tonya made it to her first final on the Inferno 2, where she had to deal with the mean girl trio of Rachel, Veronica, and Tina wanting her out throughout the season, and she was thrown into elimination twice later on in the season, where she did take out Julie and Shavonda, but she was one of the main reasons why they ended up losing the game due to her endurance, but overall it's a pretty good season for her. She had a mid at best season with Fresh Meat 1, as she was booted in the mid season portion of it with her partner Johnny, but she was really on the outs the entire season and ended up losing to Wes and Casey. Her best season is easily the Inferno 3, where she never went into elimination, and a part of that was due to the rookie strategy of consistently throwing Jen in. She held her own in the dailies and won a lifesaver on the season, which would obviously lead to her winning. Unfortunately for her, Tonya's last two seasons did not go well for her at all, as she's the first boot on the island due to the cast not liking her and getting way too drunk, also losing the face-off slash vote against Abram and Kenny, but we did see her win an elimination against DM on the Ruins, but ended up getting DQ'd relatively early on for fighting Veronica due to their bad history, and her consistent drunkenness just didn't help either. In general, I do think Tonya is a bit too inconsistent, though we saw her in a few different formats, and her elimination record is half and half, which is essentially why she is placed here. At 8th is Robin Hibbard, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 2, The Inferno 2, The Gauntlet 2, The Duel 1, The Gauntlet 3, The Island, The Duel 2, Rivals 1, and Battle of the X's 1. I feel like this continues the trend of a bunch of women who did a decent amount of the seasons and showed some strengths, but were also just pretty inconsistent, and Robin definitely fits this criteria. So her first season was Battle of the Sexes 2, where she was one of the better performing rookies on the season, and I believe she got booted right before the end game at 6th place out of the women. And this is impressive since she was a rookie and there was a rookie vet divide on the season. She was a captain for one of the few challenges that the women won during the season, and I believe the other one was thrown to them after she was gone. Unfortunately for Robin, her bad luck did not continue. Sorry. Her bad luck would kind of start on the Inferno 2, where she's the first woman booted on the season, where the drama with Tonya about Mark definitely didn't help her here, and losing to Tina in the elimination. It did help her get on the veterans team on the Gauntlet 2, where she is pretty decent enough, was never in danger, and it did help that she was linked to Mark on the team, who was arguably running the veterans team, but they end up losing the final in that janky final. She was on the dual one where she was aligned to Kina, Jodi, DM, Brad, and some of those men, which put her in a good spot. She won a daily and her only elimination win ever against Casey, which really isn't a good look, and causing her to be booted a bit past the halfway mark by Aneesa. She was initially one of the planned victims of the cut the fat strategy by the veteran men of the Gauntlet 3, but she was somehow able to get into their good graces, so she did some good politicking and proved her own in the challenges, where she made it to her second final, where the stupid rule screwed her out of a win. Unfortunately for her, the second half of her career was a complete train wreck. She did make it to the final on the island, where she beat Rachel in a vote to get her key in the final, but she started pissing off a lot of what would eventually become the JEK crew, which never repaired at all when it comes to her relationship with them. On the duel 2, she was on the outs of the season and pregnant at the time, but I don't think this was known, as she was easily sent home by rookie Kimberly. And we also saw her getting booted first with Aneesa on Rivals 1, where they lost to Paula and Evelyn in the first elimination. There was a lot of commentary from the cast about her being crazy, irrational, emotional, and all over the place, so people just didn't want to work or deal with her like that. Robin's final season, Battle of the Exes 1, did redeem her performance-wise, as she was able to win a daily with Mark, and was booted right before the final, where they would have made it had Mark not thrown his part of the elimination to Johnny. Her elimination record is really, really bad, which is one of the reasons why she isn't higher, and she was good politically in the first half of her career, but really crapped the bed in that element on the second half of her career. Unlike DM, who also has a poor elimination record similar to Robin, and she has a very few early boot appearances, a few final appearances, and one almost final appearance. But we did see her on a big team season, individual seasons, and pair seasons to a varying amount of success. At seventh is Ruthie Alcaide, who competed on a Battle of the Sexes 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, the Gauntlet 2, the Duel 2, and All Stars 1. She's a somewhat tricky and interesting person to talk about when it comes to ranking her as a player. Of course, everyone references her Battle of the Sexes 1 game, where she was easily the best woman player from a competitive point of view, even outbeating the men in several dailies as well. There was one notable flaw of hers with this game, and it's the strategic/political element, where she made dumb move after dumb move due to Emily's campaigning without any sort of foresight. This flaw continued on her next season, Battle of the Sexes 2, where she didn't want to get involved in the politics and refused to be a leader, while also not performing as strongly, though, as we see, she still made it very close to the end. Looking at her other two flagship performances, it really seemed like she only thrived in the Battle of the Sexes format, where while she did win an elimination against a checked out Jisela, who didn't even try in it, and won the first daily to become a vet captain on the Gauntlet 2 for the women, she was still booted mid-season. And this kind of continued with winning a daily on at least a season with the Duel 2, but she ended up on the outs of that season as well, and she was booted mid-season against Kimberly. She did return for All Stars over a decade later, where she did win two dailies, though I think some of them were like team wins, and she stayed out of elimination the entire season, where she did make it to the final, placing seventh. I do think All Stars definitely helped her a bit, since it was an individual season and it showed some longevity, even though it really wasn't a strategic or political season at all. She did do well in dailies, even on the seasons that she didn't perform well on, but eliminations are not her strong suit, and she is pretty poor strategically, and it seemed like outside of the battle of the sexes format, she still kind of struggles. At sixth, we have Aneesa Ferreira, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, The Gauntlet 2, The Duel 1, The Inferno 3, The Duel 2, Rivals 1, Battle of the Eras, Battle of the Exes 1, Rivals 2, Free Agents, Battle of the Bloodlines, 30-30, Total Madness, Double Agent, Spies, Lies, and Allies, Ride or Dies, and All Stars 1 as I am recording this. This one is going to take a while, though I'm going to try and not let it take a while, but there's a lot to talk about. Clearly, since Aneesa is the woman who's done the most seasons ever. The 2 seasons Aneesa did in the actually fifth era one really weren't very notable. Battle of the Sexes 1 and 2 had her being a mid-season boot on both seasons, where she didn't really have many strong performances. She was a veteran on the Gauntlets too, where there was some commentary about her lack of endurance and smoking, but she was thrown in against Beth, who quit since Aneesa was most likely going to wash her in that specific elimination. And they won a daily with her as a captain, where Aneesa's best chances of winning most likely went away due to the janky format of this final for that season. It seemed like her stride continued onto the Duel 1, where she is kind of in the minority alliance with Wes, Nehemiah, Beth, and Svetlana, and her politics was a huge issue in a lot of her earlier seasons, as she was never in the majority alliance. And she went into several eliminations in the season, beating Paula, who's the only decent name here, Robin, and DM, though she lost to Svetlana right before the final, getting third. She was in a good position on the Inferno 3 for a lot of the season politically and performance-wise, where many claimed this was her best chance of winning, but she got injured roughly halfway through the season, which plummeted her spot politically and even competitively, and she's eliminated against Paula right before the final. She remained on the outside of the majority alliance on the Duel 2, but she wasn't at the very bottom either, where she continued her elimination queen name as she eliminated Siobhan, Paula again, and Tori, where she did make it to the final, but we saw a huge issue with her poor endurance and her partner Mark throwing it for a lot of the final, so she got third. The thing with Aneesa in this period, and even in the next several seasons, is that she's a notably poor performer in dailies, and she went several seasons without ever winning one. Her worst season by far was Rivals 1, where she and Robin were sent home first against Paula and Evelyn. She did make it midway through Battle of the Exes 1 with Rachel, being the only same-sex team here, and they were on the outs politically, though I definitely blame Rachel more for that than Aneesa for that season, but they did beat Jasmine and Tyree, but lost to Paula and Dunbar a bit past the mid-season point of the season. There are a lot of almosts for Aneesa in this period, and I'm mainly referring to her almost getting to the final, which was the case for her on Rivals 2 with the DM, though I blame DM more for their poor political positioning as a lot of the house just didn't like her. Losing to Jemmye and Camilla in that season, almost getting there in the Bloodlines, where she was sent home by Cara Maria right before the final, where she made it to the location change, having relatively unnotable seasons like Free Agents, where she beat Journey and lost to Laurel. She did win a decent amount of dailies on 30-30, though they were in various formats, whether some of them were individual, some of them were partnered, some of them were a huge team, and losing eliminations against Kayla and Veronica, and winning redemption against Nicole and Marie, though losing the next redemption to Cara Maria on 30-30. She lost more eliminations than she won in this period, mainly in Era 3, causing her elimination ratio to get a lot more balanced, where there's a lot more losses adding up to a lot of her wins, causing them to be relatively equal. And the fact that she was thrown into so many eliminations during the season really isn't a good time politically. Things started somewhat turning around for Aneesa when she came back from her break on Total Madness, as she started performing better on the dailies on average and found herself in good positions politically, which would eventually lead to the formation of the Vacation Alliance. She won 2 dailies on Total Madness, beat Jenna in elimination only to lose to Bailey close to the final. She won 3 dailies on Double Agent, was aligned with several of the veterans, where she took out her BFF Tori, only to be beaten by Tula later on in the season, and she was DQ'd early on in Spice Lies Allies, despite being a Vacation Alliance member, so she would have made it far without that. She made it to her first final in over a decade on All Stars 1, where she did win a few dailies, but she got ninth, only beating the 2 people who got DQ'd in the beginning of the final, due to her lack of endurance. She made it to another final soon after this on Ride or Dies, where she and Jordan were partnered and they beat several people in eliminations, like Jack and Laurel, Casey and Kenny, Amber and Chauncey, and her injury in the final took her out against Nani, getting third. Battle of the Eras was a poor season for her, and damn near everyone who debuted on Era 1. The one thing Aneesa has in her favor is longevity, where he has seen her have success in almost every single format, but she cannot pull out the win, and the fact that she only made it to 4 finals out of like the 20-odd season she did is definitely not good. And her endurance is a huge issue, and she is now a mixed bag in eliminations, where I believe her ratio is pretty balanced. At fifth is Susie Meister, who competed on Extreme Challenge, the Gauntlet 2, the Inferno 3, and the Ruins. So we're out of that group of women who have varying levels of success but are very inconsistent. But I can honestly see myself moving Susie down a few spots depending on how I feel. So I will say that I kind of discount the first 2 seasons. So Susie's performance. Sorry, Susie's first 2 seasons aren't the most impressive in my opinion, but I don't count the first 4 seasons of the franchise, which Extreme Challenge falls under. But even with that, she was arguably the weakest person on the season, so it really isn't a strong showing of her. I don't remember a whole lot about her on The Gauntlet 2, outside of some scramble and mess about her and Cara having some supposed alliance with the guys on the other team that the rookie team didn't like, but she was never thrown into elimination during the season, and they did end up winning the season. Though, like I've mentioned, the format of the season and the final is junky as hell. She's mainly known for her last 2 seasons, where she was consistently nominated on the Inferno 3, which isn't a good thing, but she had allies like Cooley and Cara throwing the first 2 life shielders against the chagrin of their team, as the guys kind of wanted her gone, which saved herself. She did beat Jen in an elimination and won the final life shielder of the season, which helped her get to the final, but their team ended up losing. On her final season, The Ruins, she held her own against the obnoxious JEKD alliance that was running the champions team, as they did protect her, and outside of taking out Brianna in elimination, she didn't go in until all the other women were gone from their team, but she did beat Kimberly and Casey in the final female eliminations, ending her career with a second win. I am struggling with her since she is undefeated in eliminations and has a great record of making it to the finals, but all of her seasons are team seasons, which is something that I have to kind of dock her for. She only did 4 seasons and she doesn't really have longevity, but she benefits because the women are with more longevity are more inconsistent, which is why she's higher than them. At fourth place is Coral Smith, who competed on Battle of the Seasons 1, The Gauntlet 1, The Inferno 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, Fresh Meat 1, and The Gauntlet 3. Coral started her career with Mike on Battle of the Seasons 1, where they got into the inner circle from the very beginning, securing their spot in the final, and they had an easy time getting there smoothly throughout the season. They did win a daily during the season, and they were able to win the season overall. Her second season, The Gauntlet 1, had her in a comfortable position for a bit, but her poor challenge performance caused her to be sent in early elimination, where she did beat Tina. After that, she was safe for the rest of the season, and she was able to convince her team to nominate whomever she wanted to, and she got to the final, where they did lose because she got bit by a spider. Her streak would continue on her third season, The Inferno 1, where she politically ran the real world team, where she stayed out of elimination the entire season, and was able to win a life shielder to save her ass in the final elimination, where they unfortunately got runner-up again. She played on a different format on Battle of the Sixes 2, where there were no eliminations, and someone from the team went home each and every round. but she was the only vet who did not get burnt out due to the vet versus rookie dynamics on the team, as she was never sent home, despite being a captain on several of the dailies that they did lose, which led to her third runner-up in the final, and her final time reaching a final on the show. She did Fresh Meat 1, which was a paired season, where she was doing well with Evan, winning several dailies in the season, 5 of them throughout the first half of the season, which shows that she can do very well physically, where that wasn't her biggest strength in her prior seasons, but they are taken out roughly around the 60% portion of the season, where who knows how much further they could have made it without their injuries, where they both were DQ'd. Cole's final season, the Inferno 3 had her on the outs politically, where the Era 2 newbies were the ones who held control on the season and saw her as the quote-unquote fat on the veterans team, despite not being a bad performer. She did take out Beth mid-season, but was sent into elimination against Evelyn on the second to last female elimination, where she was most definitely going home, which is why she quit, despite making it close to the endgame. Coral showed on political prowess throughout her run and could hold her own competitively, despite not being the best in that area. But I do have to mention her lack of longevity in competing in all but one team season. But the ones who did compete in more formats than her were more flawed and got bumped down, which is why she was able to make it fourth on this list. So, the bronze prize of third place goes to Veronica Portillo, who competed on the Challenge 2000, Battle of the Seasons 1, Battle of the Sexes 1, the Gauntlet 1, the Inferno 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, the Inferno 2, the Ruins, Dirty 30, Vendettas, Final Reckoning, Ride or Dies, All Stars 3, and All Stars 4. I don't have much to say about Veronica on her first season, Challenge 2000, but she did win the season, but everyone knows that I see it as pretty janky now. On her second season, she was the victim of arguably the first big move in challenge history, where she and Yes were fourth on the daily, just missing the inner circle, and the three pairs in the Road Rules team wanted. They did send them home so they could stay in the inner circle. She did okay on Battle of the Sexes 1 from what I remembered, and didn't have many notable performances, where she made it to roughly two-thirds of the season, but she was outplayed by Emily, who masterminded her elimination, though Jamie did try to save her, showing some social skills, and I think she was booted at ninth on the season. It seemed like Veronica started to play more strategically and cut throat after this, where she avoided elimination all throughout the Gauntlet 1, despite the men thinking that the women are useless, and also winning 2 life savers on the season, leading to her second win, where she was arguably the strongest, if not the second strongest woman on the team. She continued her winning streak on the Inferno 1, where she was yet again one of the strongest women on the team, avoided elimination all season due to her politics, and won 4 lifesavers on the season, though one of them was thrown to her. So we did see her try to organize Katie getting sent home, and she did cause Katie to be sent into elimination several times, but it didn't pay off. So, going back to the Battle of the Sexes format in the sequel version didn't really do her much good, since there was the veterans and rookie split on the women's team, but she was shielded by Rachel, who took the early bullet and didn't do much, but yet again made it roughly around the two-thirds portion of the season, getting ninth place yet again. With the Inferno 2, she went back to being in a power position with Rachel and Tina, where they set the structure for the Badasses team, and she did win an elimination against Jodi, but her team lost the final due to nothing of her own doing. Veronica then went on a break for several years and came back on the Ruins, where she was the old woman on campus and didn't have any of her allies. She did get pretty close to Evan and did make the move that got Ibis sent into elimination over herself, but she didn't have the same pull as she did on her other seasons, causing her to be booted mid-season against Kelly Ann. She would take an even longer break slash hiatus after the Ruins, where she came back on Dirty 30, which took place like 7 years after her last season, if I'm remembering this correctly, where she did adapt well to the new cast this time and showed some of her Queen V stuff that she still had in her. She did win 4 missions on the team on the season in various formats, if I'm remembering correctly, beating Aneesa in elimination, and making the big move of burning/not bringing her vote on Leroy, which caused him to go home. But she would be sent to redemption by Jenna and lost it to Maria in the 3-quarter mark of the season. Vendettas was a notable it was an unnotable season for her, as she was DQ'd in her elimination against Aneesa midway through the season, and Final Reckoning was horrible for her due to her poor challenge performance, causing her and CT to get purged, and they had an early boot that season. And with Ride or Die, there really isn't much to talk about, as she and Darrell debuted after the first 3 to 4 eliminations, and then they only lasted like 3 to 4 rounds before they were booted. I do think that All Stars kind of helped boost her legacy, or boost it again, as it was more her speed when it comes to the cast, pacing, and the politics. She was a part of the Treehouse Alliance with Kayla, Derek, Sylvia, somewhat Roni, and I think Tina was also a part of it before she got DQ'd, and Veronica ended up getting DQ'd right before the final, and I think it's the second last woman before the final. She didn't make it to her first final in about 20 years on All Stars 4, but when you look at it, she didn't perform well in the dailies, and she convinced Nicole, literally while the elimination was about to start, to not throw her in, but to throw Jasmine in instead. Veronica can hold her own socially and politically, so her challenge abilities have decreased exponentially over the seasons and years and decades. The silver prize of second place goes to Jodi Weatherton, who competed on the Inferno 2, the Gauntlet 2, the Duel 2, Battle of the Eras, All Stars 2, and World Championship. While looking at Jodi's resume, it is crazy that she is this high on the list, not because she's the best challenge or not because she's a bad challenger, she clearly isn't, or else she wouldn't be this high, but it's mainly because she only did 6 seasons, but they're spread out over time. Jodi's first season was the Inferno 2, where she was one of the only rookies on the season. She still performed solidly on the Good Guys team and was one of the better women, but she got flustered after making the move to switch their votes at the nomination ceremony and was sent home by Veronica mid-season. She would return the next season, the Gauntlet 2, and due to the janky format of the season, she stayed out of the fray with the drama, or with the drama that the women were getting into, and she was one of the more consistent women of the season when it comes to challenge performance, where she did get her first win. As we all know, I don't hold large team wins to the strongest regard, especially due to the Jackie SL final on this specific season. And of course, the Duel 1 is her iconic season, where she was in an alliance with Kina, DM, and Robin, which had a good amount of control on the season, where they were working with some of the stronger men on the season as well. Jodi ended up winning over half of the missions, 7 of them if I remember correctly, and had an easy march to victory over Svetlana on an individual season. Jodi left the show and wouldn't return for 15 years, but she didn't miss a beat on All Stars 2. She did go into an early elimination to beat Sophia, won 4 missions throughout the season, and it seemed like her alliance with the likes of Brad, Janelle, Janae, MJ, and Darrell was coming out on top with the strategic dynamic this season and competitively, but she and Brad had to face elimination against Janelle and Darrell right before the final, where they ended up losing. Her future seasons didn't receive the same amount of success, but she made it relatively far on World Championship, despite being partnered with the Argentinian Benji, and with a bunch of people and alumni that she didn't know, but they beat Naya and Rodrigo early on, only to lose a later elimination to Casey and Troy soon before the endgame. And then we all knew or know about Battle of the Eras, where she is sent home second to Avery, and I don't hold it against her much due to the audience held and due to her being the furthest from the audience. I do wish that she had more seasons, but she showed herself to be a strong competitor in both versions of her career. She can hold her own politically and is pretty well rounded. Gold prize of first place goes to Rachel Robinson, who competed on Battle of the Sexes 1, the Gauntlet 1, Battle of the Sexes 2, the Inferno 2, the Island, the Duel 2, Battle of the X's 1, Battle of the Eras, and All Stars 4. It is kind of crazy that Rachel is number 1 out of all of the era 1 women, but it does make sense that the top 2 women on this list for this era have both won individual seasons. Rachel's first season was on Battle of the Sexes 1, where she did show glimpses of being a good competitor, but she was blindsided because the women of the inner circle didn't like her, which caused her to be booted relatively early. When they changed the format of the show to be more about competition on the Gauntlet 1 and strategy, she thrived more as she was one of the stronger women on the Road Rules team, and they ended up easily winning the season. Her first of 3 wins, but this is arguably her least impressive due to the team format. Going back to the older format of Battle of the Sexes with the sequel, the same fate happened to her here, where she was too cocky and sloppy politically, where Katie organized a flip on the veteran girls and Rachel got the bullet, taking her out around the midway point here, or a bit before the midway point again. Going back to a more competitive format on the Inferno 2, she didn't see an elimination the entire season, like the Gauntlet 1, because she was aligned with Tina and Veronica and had some sort of political control, while being the strongest woman on the team, only for them to lose in the final, which wasn't her fault. Rachel will go on a bit of a hiatus, where she did return to the island, where if you have seen the pattern of how she does on vote-out seasons, this doesn't end up voting well for her. She rallied the votes to attempt to get out Bananas in the second vote, which backfired, and when she lost the face-off against Kellyanne, she was a dead woman walking against Robin, being the second woman voted out, which is easily her worst performing season. She came back the very next season on the Duel 2, and we saw her thrive, where she is in the majority alliance with Mark, Evan, Brad, Landon, Brittany, Tori, and DM, and they controlled the season. She won 4 dailies throughout the season, never went to elimination, and was a clear best woman on the season, where she got her second win, which is an individual win. Rachel was partnered with Aneesa on Battle of the X's 1, where they weren't in the majority alliance on the season, and I do kind of blame her for that due to her poor politics this season, and even somewhat alienating Mark, causing them to be targeted earlier on in the season. But they won against Jasmine and tied in the elimination, and was sent home roughly midway through the season against Dunbar and Paula. It would take Rachel over a decade to come back, where she made her grand return on All Stars 4 with her mean girls, Veronica and Tina. Unfortunately for Rachel, she did find herself on the outs, despite getting her start immediately after getting immunity on the first daily, and she was put in the second, or technically the first, elimination against Ayanna, whom she did beat, but was thrown in against Cara Maria, where she lost early in a stupid elimination. Rachel made her grand return on the flagship franchise on Battle of the Eras, where she won immunity on the first daily, but Era 1 consistently lost the dailies, and ended up getting to elimination, where they essentially got purged, but her. Rachel had to beat Jonay and Avery in elimination, and won the final team challenge on her own, but things turned around for her when things went individual. She was a part of Bananas' Angels, with Bananas, Jenny, and Aviv being close to Josh as well and making a deal with Jordan. And with an immunity win during the second half of the season, she ended up making it to the final. The fact that she made it to the end with her circumstances was great, though her winning due to the copper points was a bit lame. Rachel mainly suffers from she mainly suffers in the older, janky, and weaker format, but thrives in the format of the show that the show is commonly more associated with, especially from a strategic and a competitive point of view. So her being first here makes sense, especially after her performance on Battle of the Eras, where she was going against the toughest woman on every single era, for the most part. So that is my ranking of how I see the Era 1 women as challenge players based on their gameplay and challenge performances throughout the decades, and the ones that have done at least 3 seasons. So I did find this one to be a bit more challenging because the female GOATs and the best female challengers aren't discussed at length anywhere near as much as the men are. And just looking at the list of the Era 1 women, a lot of them only did seasons that had weaker format, and a lot of them only did like 3 or 4 seasons. So it's kind of hard to really compare a lot of them. But that is how I ended up ranking the Era 1 women. It will be interesting to see how they stack up against the women from the other 3 eras. Though a lot of them didn't transcend eras, so that's definitely an interesting element as well. So essentially, I'm going to do a bunch of these videos for Obviously, I already did Era 1 men and Era 2 women, but I'm going to do the same for Era 2 men, Era 3 and 4 men, and Era 3 and 4 women too. So, thank you all for watching this, and I'll be back with more content soon. Take care!